Hi, hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Business Empowerment Evening organized by GBN Marketplace Ministry. Thank you for logging in on time. My name is Desmond and I'm your host tonight. At every Business Empowerment Evening, we present to you Christian marketplace leaders to share their faith journey in their business. In so we glean wisdom and encouragement from their experiences. You have probably come to this webinar either because you're on our mailing list or received an invite from a friend. In either case, we welcome you and we hope you'll be edified by our session tonight. At GBN Marketplace Ministry, we are all volunteers and we do not charge registration fees. As such, we welcome free will offerings to defray some of the operating costs as we continue to do God's work via this webinar platform. If you felt led to make a free will offering, you may do so via PayNow using the QR code or the UEN number on the screen. The details will also be in the next few slides for the ease of your reference. For those of you who may be new to GBN, allow me to introduce GBN's vision and mission. GBN's vision is to see a transformed marketplace for Jesus. We want to help Christians, that's you, succeed and have an impact for Jesus. We do this through a threefold mission. Our mission is discipling Christian marketplace leaders through three core principles. First, we empower them to do business God's way. Second, we equip them to live a life of integrity and manage their business or perform their work with kingdom values. Third, we commission them to go out to the marketplace and communities to make a positive impact for Christ. Besides business empowerment evenings that you're currently tuned into right now, we also organize workshops and conferences at other times. Here are some of the past speakers at our workshops and conferences, where we have had Lucas Chow, Anthony Tan, Rachel Lim, Philip Ng, to name a few. You will find recordings for some of these events on our website, gbn.sg, and also on our YouTube channel. Besides workshops and conferences, we also organize small group meetings called Business Empowerment Circles, BEC for short. This is typically a monthly meeting that brings together small groups of marketplace believers to discuss topic of the month, and each session usually lasts about 1.5 to 2 hours. The difference between a BEC and a typical cell group is our emphasis on discussion around marketplace issues. We welcome you to join us at such monthly meetings, and we are happy to announce that registration for next year's BEC is now open. More details are available at our website. At the same time, we also have curated 10 years of marketplace topics, which we are more than happy to share with churches and para-church organizations who may be interested to kickstart marketplace ministries. You may email us for more details. We also offer a unique mentoring program that allows us to impact marketplace leaders on an individual level. At Business Mentoring Program, we have a panel of mentors who are highly experienced in their respective fields and matured in faith. Our mentees range from business leaders to working professionals looking for godly counsel aligning their faith and work. If you are keen, do check out our mentoring program and visit our website for more details. And this is a quick glance on how you can reach us: our website, email, and other social media platforms. We will be moving on to our main segment shortly. Today's sharing will be split to two sessions. First, the sharing by our guest speaker, and after, we will follow up with a Q&A session. You may submit questions using the Q&A feature, and we will do our best to have all of them answered depending on the time. GBN is very privileged to have Mr. Darren Tan, Director of Invictus Law Corporation, with us tonight. Darren was once a troubled youth, a regular in jail. He was jailed for 10 years and received 19 strokes of the cane for offenses such as armed robbery, and drug trafficking. At age 14, at his third sentence, which he described as the lowest point of his life, Darren found God. Now, let us hear from Darren and how, through a series of God arranged circumstances, he resumed his studies under the prison's program, relearned English, aced his A levels, applied for law school, and became the first student with a criminal past to be admitted to the National University of Singapore Law School. Let us now warmly welcome Darren to share with us.
Thank,
Darren,
thank you, Desmond. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just share my screen. Okay, first, I want to thank the ministry, specifically Desmond and his team, for the invitation. And this is not just a lip service. I still remember the first time I met Desmond and his team. I was having back-to-back meetings on that day, every 1 hour slot, and my previous meeting had overrun. So when I eventually sat down with Desmond, I was, to be completely honest, a bit flustered and edgy. But as I opened my heart and started to share the Lord's blessings in my life, the Spirit flowed within me. I was instantly rejuvenated and time just stood still. So, needless to say, the meeting with Desmond overran, but I was completely at peace with it. And that brings me to my next point, which is that as I was preparing for today's sharing and I was recounting the Lord's blessings in my life, it occurred to me that with the limited amount of time we have tonight, I will not be able to completely do justice to God's amazing work in my life. Well, not that I could ever do that, but it made me acutely conscious that as to how best I could tell his story through my story in the most time efficient manner. I think the point here is that I am truly abundantly blessed. A brief introduction: I am a practicing lawyer, a litigator to be exact. As Desmond alluded to earlier, I have been in and out of prison since I was 18 years old. I spent a total of almost 11 years in prison, receiving 19 strokes of the cane for various offenses. But what some of you may not know is that I also had the dubious honor to be the first person to be charged under the then recently passed Synthetic Drug Amendments to the Misuse of Drugs Act. That was in 2006. The amendment was barely 1 month old, and the authorities wasted no time in splashing my mugshot all over the state media. In the past, I never stayed out of prison for more than a year in between my imprisonments. Each time I came out, I will be back to prison within a matter of months. The longest I had stayed out of prisons was just 11 months. So my parents used to tell me that prisons was like my home, and I will come back to them only for short holidays. Okay, let me just begin with the first slide. Okay, so I'm the child in the middle. My parents, they were with me. I have quite an interesting family when it comes to matters of faith. My father is a Christian, and so is the rest of the extended family on his side. My mother is a Taoist and practices ancestral worship, and so it is with the rest of the extended family on her side. I got to know of the existence of God. I don't know God then through my paternal grandparents. So my paternal grandmother, she was saved by a Catholic priest from being sold into slavery in China. She was put on a boat and she came to Singapore. And from then on, the entire family became Christians. My grandmother would always tell me that Jesus was my friend and I could always call upon him whenever I was afraid or feeling lonely. I grew up in a kampong or village for our foreign friends in Bukit Panjang. My father used to be a lorry driver and always away from home. I moved into a HDB estate in Boon Lay when it was time for me to attend kindergarten. By then, my father had gotten a job as a coffee shop assistant, so he didn't have to travel that much. But this job still demanded that he work from about 12 noon to 2 to 3 a.m. the following day, every day. He had only 2 days off a year, and that is during Chinese New Year. So the way I communicated with him was that I will leave notes on the table for him so that he could read when he came back. My mother, uh, she had a gambling issue. She would often bring me to the gambling dens so that she could look after me and then be engaged in the activity at the same time. But she soon stopped bringing me because I think I was too much of a trouble and I brought her bad luck. So I became a latchkey kid at a very young age of 7. And the neighborhood I lived in was it was quite rough. That was the 80s. It was the heyday of heroin use. Drug addicts can be found everywhere in the neighborhood: staircase landings, children's playground, car parks. Remember being very afraid when I saw these people. The area was also infested with gangs, and gang activities were quite prevalent. I was bullied a lot when I was a kid. I think you can see from the photo I was a very small size. But at the same time, I also looked up to the gangsters in the neighborhood. I actually aspired to be like them because they seem to have everything going for them, right? Okay. So quite naturally, I would say, I joined a gang when I was 13, started taking drugs at the same age. My first brush with the law was when I was 14, was arrested for rioting. I was sacked from school when I was 17. A year later, I was sentenced to reformative training center by the court for robbery. And then I will go on to spend the next 10 years of my life being in and out of prisons. And because of that, I never could hold down a job in the past. I have worked as a cleaner, a waiter, production operator, a warehouse assistant. I never staying for more than a few months on the job, sometimes even just days. But more pertinently, I think criminal and drug activities pay much better and require less effort. I made the decision to turn my life around one night. Uh, about 20 years ago, right? Now it's 2021. I was then serving an 8-year sentence in a maximum security prison. I had gotten into a fight with another inmate. I was thrown into solitary confinement in a punishment cell. Um, that inmate was actually my friend, so he betrayed me to the authorities, which led to me being in prison, and then hence the fight. In the punishment cell, the cells were painted black. There was a lone yellow light shining at you all the time. So I felt disoriented and very miserable. And the days turned into weeks. And with each passing day, I just got I thought about my life up to that point, and then I felt that life was so meaningless. I was very disgusted with human nature and very tired of living. I felt that life was so cheap. Being involved in gangs and drugs just meant getting killed, jailed, or forced to go on the run. I look at the older prisoners around me, they were like a mirror to me. I could see my future in them, actually. And I was convinced that even if I were to take my own life or disappear uh, there and then, no one would actually care. So yeah, I was truly at the lowest point of my life. And then I cried out to God. I said, God, I don't want to continue living my life like this. I can, I will follow you, but what could I be? So God asked me, what do you want to be? I then issued a seemingly impossible challenge to God. I said, if you are so great, make me a lawyer. Honestly, I was just mocking him, right? Because that seemed impossible at that time. But then a great peace descended upon me as if God was telling me, is that all? It is done, right? So I claimed that promise there and then, right? But what goes on from there, right? I was still in prison. I'm still going to be in prison. Was still going to be in prison for a long time. I did not have the qualifications. Hell, I didn't even know what qualifications were required to become a lawyer at that time. Worse still, I had lost the ability to speak English. Hokkien was my first language. Malay was my second language. In fact, if I had told anyone that I was going to be a lawyer, I would probably have been laughed at, to say the least. But God opened doors one after another, and each time He would never fail to remind me that it was by His grace and not by my own efforts. So when I returned to general population from the punishment cell, I was filled with the Spirit. I had 3 years left on my sentence then, and I thought, okay, I was going to make, was ready to make the most out of it. So I went ahead, relying on my own effort. I went to apply to go to prison school. I applied twice and was rejected twice. The reason is quite simple. I mean, I just got back from the punishment cell. I wasn't exactly a model inmate. And prison school at that time was a new concept. I believe it was the first in Asia. It was new and it could not afford to fail. So they have very strict criteria for people entering a prison school. And then I began to doubt and complain to God, like, why are you setting me up for a disappointment and twice in a row? Um, I couldn't see it then, but it was God preparing me for a whole new culture and environment in prison school. And I'll elaborate on this later. So not long after, a notice was being put up in the prison yard, asking students or asking applicants to apply in order to fill up this NITEC class. So NITEC is basically ITE, right? NTC2, a NITEC class in computer networking, and that was to be conducted in prison school. God prompted me to sign up for it, and I was like, God, are you serious? I had less than 3 years to go, and you want me to spend 1 year on an ITE education? Like, how is that going to help me reach my goal? And again, I couldn't see where that was going, but I signed up anyway, right? And it turned out that prison school needed a quota to fill this class so that it could start. And I was eventually selected, and then I was transferred to prison school. So that was like a backdoor, a route to prison school, right? Signing up for this course. But when I reached there, I regretted my decision immediately. Prison school had a totally different culture from maximum security. The inmates there were required to speak English for one, and that literally made me sweat every time I did that. The gang culture was heavily suppressed. The prison's rules were much stricter, and inmates were treated like kids. I really hated that. And worse still, the NITEC course, which was supposed to take 1 year to complete, was restructured to take 2 years to complete. That was so that prison school could concurrently run two courses at the same time, and then so students will attend class for only half a day rather than a full day during the study week. Naturally, again, I was discouraged, for that would mean that I would only have about 9 months left on my sentence after I completed my NITEC course. So again, I questioned God, what have you got me into, right? Uh, but it turned out to be the perfect plan. Okay, why? So I was supposed to attend the NITEC class for half a day, but the style of our tutor for that class was to teach for half to 1 hour max, right? Every session, and then he will go for a tea break for the rest of the class. So the students were left alone most of the time. And because this was a NITEC course in computer networking, two students got to share one computer, which was a luxury in prisons. And it further turned out that previous batches of NITEC students, mischievous as they were, had installed various hidden games on the computers. So my batch of NITEC students, we will spend most of their, not me, they will spend most of their time playing computer games while the tutor took his long tea breaks. But miraculously, previous batches of NITEC students also installed the complete set of the Britannica encyclopedia on these computers. And better still, I had the shared computer to myself as my partner. He was quite old, not really into playing computer games. But I also think that he was inspired by my desire to study, and he didn't want to deprive me of the chance to do that on the computer. So for the next 2 years, I educated myself by reading the encyclopedia on the computer, covering history, philosophy, geography, economics, and the like. Fast forward 2 years later, I graduated from my NITEC class with 9 months left on my sentence. So I asked God again, what now? God said, apply to the A level class. That's easier said than done. Okay, first, I had only 9 months left, hardly enough time to prepare well for the exams. And by then, I had found out from the prison school's library the requirements to read law in a local university. They are actually quite, the bar is actually quite high, right? Second, it was very unusual in prison school for a NITEC student to jump straight to the A-level class. As alluded to earlier, prison school was a new concept, could not be seen to have failed. And I might be seen as a liability in terms of the statistics for the A-level class, in the sense that I was probably going to pull down the average. And third, The A level class in prison school was a luxury, and most of the resources were devoted to classes up to the O level. Okay, so I will practically be on my own. All right, if I even if I got admitted into the class. Okay, I think the principal was probably thinking along the same lines as me because he rejected my application to be transferred to the A level class. So I reverted to my whiny self, thinking God had failed me again. God say try again, and this time he put a thought in my mind as to how to go about applying. Okay, eventually the school principal accepted my application on the basis that number one, I would join the A level class but register for the exams as a private student, and number two, that I will take the exams outside of prisons. I will go on to obtain four A's and a B in my A level exams, including an A1 in general paper. Right? Okay, that should be something to be happy about because God had kept His end of the bargain. But God also uh, knows that I was not ready to go any further, and He had to make me ready. So I was released from prison. I did my A level outside of prisons, but I was back to prisons just 6 months after my release. Practically, it's just enough time for me to take the A level exams and then get the results. It came as a surprise to everyone around me, even to myself. So no doubt I was a new creation in Christ, and granted I stayed away from gangs and drugs. I found a job as an electronic salesman. I went back home every day. I even managed to give a small amount to my parents from my monthly salary of $1,000. But what I hadn't learned at that point was to cut ties with the people from my past or the influences, right? Because I still valued the brotherhood and the friendships forged over the years. I thought I was strong, but I was I was weak. And my weakness was not knowing how to say no to my friends. Um, I will learn. I will come to learn of this much later. But I think the biggest challenge for any ex-offender in his journey towards change is probably the acute sense of loneliness from having to leave behind things that are familiar and reassuring to him. So the friends, the lifestyle, the entire support, social support structure, as well as the fear of the uncertainty from having to accept, much less to embrace a new order. And that I think is the reason why most ex-offenders relapse, because they would want to seek the sense of belonging, the sense of being understood from the past lives. So how did I end up in prison again? In a nutshell, a friend from the past reconnected with me. He was in a lot of trouble, wanted my help. He had no credibility, while I had built up a lot of goodwill with a lot of people over the years. I sought help from people who trusted me to help my friend, and I landed myself in debts that I could not afford to pay. Perhaps it was pride, and perhaps it was also a desire not to let the people who trusted me down. I went back to trafficking drugs again, thinking that I will pay off the debts and then I will go back to becoming a lawyer. But even though I was back to trafficking drugs again, I made a conscious effort not to take drugs. But eventually, things got worse. One day, I was asked by another friend to deliver drugs to her downstairs my block. So in the lift, I suddenly realized like what I was doing, and I hated myself for doing that. And I popped a tranquilizer pill, which is a controlled drug in Singapore, into my mouth while the lift descended to level one. Less than a minute later, when the lift opened, I was surrounded by law enforcement officers and I was arrested for possession of drugs. So obviously, my friend had betrayed me. I was very defiant. I displayed my anger and aggression towards the officers, and in the scuffle that ensued, I spit out the tranquilizer pill. But that 1 minute that the tranquilizer pill stayed in my mouth, cost me 5 years imprisonment because I was a repeat drug user. And after I was brought back to the police station and all the paperwork was settled, I just felt that my whole world came crashing down. I felt that the promise was no more. No way was I going to recover from this. Uh, and as I was headed to court to be sentenced, I was ready to just let everything go. But then I felt this prompting when I reached the courtroom to write my own mitigation plea. So I asked the court orderly for pen and paper, and I did that. At that point, I still had enough faith to tell the court that to tell the court about my A-level results and my aspiration to become a lawyer. And I ended off with a promise to the court that the next time I come back to this courtroom, it would not be as an accused person. I think the court accepted my plea as a mitigation because I was given the lowest possible sentence. And by God's grace, I've kept my promise to the court until today, right? And then when I arrived at maximum security prison again, uh, that's when reality struck. That was not my longest prison sentence, but it was the hardest for me to bear. Hardest because I had tasted the goodness of God. I had changed my mind. Essentially, I repented. And then here I was, back to square one. And this time, this time around, the fall was much, much greater. And for the longest time in there, I had unforgiveness and anger in my heart. I was angry with myself. I was angry with the world. I was also angry with God. I tried to get myself back to prison school. They wouldn't accept me back, obviously. I had let the principal, the teachers, the officers, and everyone who actually cared for me, let them down. And also because the policy of prison school was that any inmate had only one chance to go to prison school because tremendous resources were expended on the school or on each inmate there. So I became even more devastated. So every day I just kept to myself. I just read. I didn't even want to speak to anyone. And then something familiar happened. There's a notice on the notice board seeking applicants to undergo a few months long multimedia training workshop in the prison school. And the top performing trainees will be able to secure a job in the multimedia hub in prison school. So this time around, without even a need for God's prompting, I signed up immediately. So eventually, I topped the workshop. I got a spot working in the multimedia hub in prison school. And again, this was not apparent to me then, but it was part of God's plan for me. The skills that I learned at the Multimedia Hub in prison school allowed me to earn a decent living when I eventually went to law school. It definitely paid better than giving tuition, right? So I was equipped with a skill that I could use for 4 years uh, while I was in law school, right? And I learned those skills just before I entered law school. And also, being physically in prison school gave me a better platform to apply to law school. Okay, and I will elaborate on this later. But more importantly, this whole experience of falling again, ensured that I will never step foot into a prison again. Okay, so now I would attempt to show the extent of God's amazing grace in my life from that point on. I graduated from NUS Faculty of Law in 2013. By then, I was 31 years old, and 10 years had passed since the night that God promised to make me a lawyer. When I wanted to read law in NUS, many well meaning people tried to dissuade me from taking the step. Their opinion was that no local law schools would take me in, and that even if I did, even if any law school took me in, I still couldn't become a lawyer. So what's the point of setting myself up for future disappointments? In fact, one practicing lawyer who was also a volunteer in the prisons ministry, so he volunteered as a counselor, told me this: don't even try. It's impossible. Go read the Legal Profession Act. Those were his exact words. And even after I gained admission to law school, people continued to tell me that this was a bad idea, right? As no law firm would take me in, I could never be admitted to the Singapore bar anyway. Sometimes um, those these things posed to me made me question God as well, but I chose to trust Him. And again, I will know this only much later. But NUS law, at the point of my application, they were deliberating whether they should make an exception in my case, not because I was a prisoner, So they didn't consider that. They just view every applicant the same. But their deliberation was whether they should bring the admissions test and interview to me in prison, given that I was still in prison, while other applicants were required to take the same at the faculty. So in the end, two professors volunteered to bring the tests and the interviews to me in prison. And eventually I was offered a place and accepted the offer to read law at NUS. The first few months after my release from, so I was late for school because I applied to NUS when I was still serving my sentence, and when I was released, school term had started, so I was late for school. And because I was late for school, I was completely lost the first day I entered law school, and the first few months of my release was a very trying period for me. So I was thrown into the school system right away. I felt so lost. I was this guy sporting a weird hairstyle and wearing clothes from a long forgotten era. On a few occasions, people actually asked me whether I was an exchange student. I didn't have laptops or textbooks, and I was the only yes, I think I was the only person in class to use pen and paper. And every day I would go to the botanic gardens, which is beside my school during break time, and I would sit alone in the park because I didn't dare to make any friends because I was very conscious of my background. What was I going to say to them, right? If we became too close, right? And because communications between the faculty, the professors, and students were effected through email, I was also often out of the loop as to what was going on in school. By the way, before I entered law school, I never had an email address and I never used email before. And I had to use the computers in the school's computer lab to get course notes and submit assignments. So I was always behind others, right? Because I don't have information like at my fingertips. And I remember one incident that really made me want to give up altogether. So there was this last minute change of venue for a certain class, and I wasn't aware of it, right? So I entered into a classroom that was empty, and then I panicked. I didn't know I didn't know who to turn to. I had no friends. I didn't know who to call, who to ask. So I began to search all the classrooms, starting from level one. Then as I was going up the stairs, the sole of one of my shoes came off. I was wearing a pair of 4-year-old sneakers, so the shoes were before I went to prison. So I came out, I wore those same shoes again. And as I dragged the sole along, continued my search for the class, and tried to convince myself that no one was looking at me, I thought I should just give up and then go home. I felt so ashamed and embarrassed for some reason. But fortunately, I didn't have the money to go home, so I stayed on, right? But it is in times like that that I truly experienced the grace of God. He sent people to bless me. A church friend, despite being stationed in Hong Kong at the time, and I had not met him for years, managed to contact me and offered to sponsor my textbooks for my first year. Another Christian brother guaranteed my loan to purchase a laptop. Another helped me with stationery. The list goes on, right? So I will be truly indebted to them, and of course, obviously to God, right? I was called to the Singapore bar in 2014. I trained under a senior counsel who was also the then president of the Law Society. How I came to be hired by his firm was also nothing short of a miracle, but I don't think I have the time now to tell the story. In fact, I think time is running. My greatest worry up to that point was always this, that despite all that I've done, despite graduating from school, I would be denied admission to the bar because of my criminal history. In fact, just 3 days before my call date, the Law Society required me to file a supplementary affidavit detailing each of my past offences and the circumstances surrounding the same. I believe I was the only person to ask to do that, right? So I did that, and I had to swear this affidavit in front of a commissioner of oath, who in my case happened to be a very senior lawyer of 30 years standing. So typically, commissioner of oath, they just take an oath, right? But in this case, he read my affidavit, and then he told me that uh, this was the first time he was seeing someone's call papers written in this way. And he told me in all seriousness and earnestness and with the best of intentions that I should be prepared that I might not be admitted to the bar. And I can tell you this, even on the call date itself, as I was standing to be sworn, my legs were still shaking because as ridiculous as this may sound now, I actually thought someone was just going to jump up and object to my call. But as it turned out, I became the first person with such a long string of criminal convictions to be admitted to the Singapore bar. And God promise had come to pass, but his unmerited favors never cease from here. I received the JCI's 10 Outstanding Young Persons of the World Award in 2013. I was appointed to the 13th National Youth Council, which is the policy making body for youth programs in Singapore in 2013. I was invited by the then Attorney General of the Attorney General's Chambers to speak at an outreach event in 2013. I believe this was the first time that the Attorney General invited an ex-criminal to speak about our criminal justice system in a public event. Also received an invitation from His Royal Highness Prince Edward, Earl of Wessex, to deliver a speech regarding youth issues at a closed-door event in London in 2014. I was appointed as a member of the CSR subcommittee of the Singapore Academy of Law since 2015. I'm still on the committee now. The primary objective of this committee is to raise awareness and funds for the Yellow Ribbon Star Bursary. This appointment is particularly meaningful for me, as I myself was a recipient of this bursary when I was studying in NUS. I also made the list of Prestige Singapore 40 under 40 young professionals in 2015. I was appointed in 2015 as an independent director to an institution of public character, which is the charitable organization. I'm still serving on the board today. In the same year, I was nominated Singaporean of the Year by the Straits Times. I also made the list of Singapore Business Review's Singapore's most influential lawyers under the age of 40 in 2017. In the same year, I was appointed to serve on the Rehabilitation Committee of Yellow Ribbon Singapore, which is a statutory board under the Ministry of Home Affairs. This committee looks into employment opportunities for ex-offenders, which is something very dear to my heart. And last year, I received the inaugural NYAA Honorary Gold Award. Honorary because I was overage. Something interesting, I accomplished my silver and bronze awards while serving time in prison school 18 years ago. And 18 years later, I received this Honorary Gold Award back in the new prison school, which also happened to be the maximum security prison that I was at when God made me the promise. God also placed a burden in my heart for migrant workers. I've acted pro bono for quite a number of foreign workers in their salary claims against errant employers. The claim amounts are typically small by our standards, but a very huge sum to these workers. In fact, it is common for them and their families to borrow money in order to be able to come to Singapore to work. And obviously, these workers can ill afford a lawyer who could help them to take back what was rightfully theirs, which is their salary. And I regard um, the chance to fight for the powerless and helpless as a blessing from God. The photo on the top right is very meaningful to me. The woman beside me, she also used to be a lawyer. She's now a volunteer with a VWO in Singapore for migrant workers. So they had approached me to act for a woman of Chinese nationality. She was in her 50s and she worked in Singapore as a dishwasher at a restaurant. She was owed more than 6 months' salary when her employees sent her back to China. So this photo was taken outside the restaurant after we managed to get a $10,000 check from the employer to settle her claims. She was waiting by the phone, and we couldn't wait to share the good news with her, so we just took the photo and then sent it to her via WeChat. And most importantly, God blessed me with my own family. I never thought I deserved uh, to have my own family because for a large part of my life, I brought only pain and suffering to those who love me. I was selfless to a fault in my dealings with my gang members and friends, but extremely selfish when conducting myself towards my family. In 1997, someone set fire to my house after a drug deal went wrong. So my mother and I were in the house. Eventually, we were rescued. We were conveyed to the hospital. My first reaction after I woke up was not to see how my mother was doing. but to leave the hospital to seek revenge on the person who has set fire to my house. Okay, in closing, I just want to share some verses that I hold dear in my walk with the Lord so far. Some of you will be familiar with some of the verses. So Jeremiah 29, 11. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with that. God has a plan to prosper me. Right? Romans 8:28, which also inspired the title of my sharing today. It was also the verse that I wrote in my letter to my paternal grandmother, who introduced me to the faith just before she died. Um, she didn't write back to me, but before she died, she told my parents to convey to me that the fact that I could write this verse showed that I had repented, I had changed my mind, and that she could go in peace. I also want to uh, refer to Joel chapter 2, verse 25. And I will restore to you the years that the locusts had eaten. And truly, I will say that this verse has come to pass in my life. Second Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I had a real and deep appreciation of this verse when I was in prison. I knew I could not depend on myself, and so I could only rely on God. And that act of reliance is also an exercise of faith. And God loves that. For if you are strong, you have no need for God. You can do everything yourself. If there's no need for you to rely on God, on faith. Right? And another interesting verse is Psalms chapter 31, verse 15. It says, "My times are in your hands." Okay, this is interesting to me because the meaning of the verse is probably that the days of our lives are in the hands of God. But I claim it as a promise that God would multiply the time I have in a day and making me more time efficient. And the fact is that it works, right? I think sometimes the test is really of our faith rather than on our understanding. I think the simplest, most innocent faith can go a long way. I have come to the end of my sharing. Uh, I was asked to summarize three key takeaways from my sharing today, which I did. But then I examined them again and realized that uh, they could just be distilled into one takeaway, which is to exercise our faith. Whether is it to trust in the Lord when it's difficult to do so, when the route before you is unclear, and you just have to trust in the Lord. Whether is it knowing that His ways are higher than ours, knowing that He has a time for everything in our lives, and we just have to trust His timing. That when we are weak, we are strong in Christ, right? That all this takes an exercise of faith. All glory be to God. Thank you for your time. Back to you, Desmond.